Hello students. In today's session we have with us Dr. Namita Rajput. She is principal at Aurobindo College Evening at University of Delhi. Today she will be delivering a lecture on the topic the role of the media in ensuring corporate governance. Students, if you have any queries, please feel free to contact the toll-free number 1800 110 430. So without wasting much time, let us welcome ma'am. Hello ma'am.
So the topic of today is the role of media in ensuring the corporate governance. As you all know that today media is playing a most important role, whether it is corporate governance or building the public opinion. It affects the reputation also. So media has a very responsible role to play. So let me come on to a straight on the topic, the corporate governance, the role of media. The media can play a very significant and a vital role in the corporate governance by affecting the reputation in at least three ways. First, the media attention can drive the politicians to introduce the corporate law reforms, ensure the corporate laws in the belief that inaction would hurt their future potential and political careers or shame them in the eyes of the public opinion both at home and abroad. Secondly, the media attention could affect the reputation through the standard channel, the most economic models to emphasize. The manager's wages in future depend on the shareholder and the future employee beliefs about whether the managers will attend their retention in those situations where they cannot be monitored. The concern about the monetary penalty can lead the managers not to take advantage of the opportunities for self-dealing as to create a belief that they are a good manager. Thirdly, the media attention affects not only the managers and board members' reputation in the eyes of shareholders and the future employers, but the media attention affects their reputation in the eyes of society at large. So, the media do play a role in shaping the public opinion of the corporate managers, directors. So, in doing, they pressurize them to behave in accordance with the societal norms. Depending on the situation, this pressure can lead to shareholders' value maximization also. In a country like India, where there is a variety of newspapers in various languages in circulation, on an average, there is a better environmental responsiveness owing to the circulation which is present. Now, this is true even after controlling for the extent of environment regulation, the availability of information on environmental outcomes and the level of economic development measured as GDP per capita. Now let me give you some important points in relation to the importance of media. Nowadays, the media has a very responsive and a vital role to play. The press pressure managers to act not in just the shareholders' interest, but also in a publicly acceptable way, and at times this also helps the country to improve its corporate governance. At times the power of media is so intense that a change takes place even in the absence of any legal requirement to act or a legal liability not to act. For example, the former Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, Karunanidhi, arrest incidents where the police, in order to maintain a law and order situation, had to release a police tape which otherwise were said to be very confidential and not meant for the public viewing. Now coming on to advertising. Advertising in India is a big business, though small compared to United States and Europe. The main lacuna is that there is no agency or a regulator to control the advertising. Advertising is constantly bombarded by the criticism. Now it is accused of encouraging materialism, consumption, stereotyping. They drive us to purchase certain items which we do not want. So basically they are taking advantage of females, the children, of manipulating the behavior, because as far as the impulse buying is concerned, the main, the fallouts are on the females and the children. They use, various tactics, various appeals to affect their mind so as to convert their thoughts into buying action. So not only this, it also contributes to the downfall and of the social system. Not only many different media and techniques employed in advertising, advertising itself is of several different kinds. So let me give a account of all these. The commercial advertising for products is there, of the services is there, public service advertising on behalf of various institutions is there, then a cause and a phenomena of growing importance today, the political advertising in the interest of the parties and the candidates, wherein they discuss their manifestos, their programs to be delivered and deliberated in the coming years, etc. Making allowances for differences among the different kinds and the methods of advertising, we intend what follows to be applicable to all of them. Now, of course, there are plus points, there are negative points. So let me now give you the harms of using the advertising as a media tool. Advertising can betray its role as a source of information by misrepresentation and withholding the relevant facts. Now, before discussing this, let me give you the main important role which the advertising can give. The advertising is a media tool in terms of information dissemination. Now, what is information dissemination? That is, whatever facts you want to give it to the public at large, you use the advertising, which is a paid media promotion channel, etc., to give all the benefits about the products, etc. So, it's a paid concept. So, not only the information dissemination is there, you use the advertising as a persuasion channel also. That means you try and persuade the customers and the target customers at large to, buy the products which they don't want. So media has got a power, the advertising has got the power to influence the purchase behavior of the people at large. And not only this, that is the information dissemination, persuasion, but also it is used as a remembrance tool also in case the people are forgetting about your product. So some kind of an advertisement will come which states that we are still there, we are catering for last 200 years. For example, Johnson & Johnson, etc., about the Maruti also, about the outreach programs, etc. So advertising can betray its role also, not only as a source of the information, but also by misrepresentation and withholding the relevant facts. Sometimes too, the information function of a media can be subverted by the advertiser's pressures upon publication of programs not to deal with a question that might prove embarrassing or inconvenient. More often, the advertising is used not simply to inform, but to persuade, to motivate, to convince people to act in a certain way. As I told you that it's a information dissemination technique, it's a persuasion technique, and it's also a convincing technique for the public at large. Basically, if you keep on showing the advertisement through various campaign programs, through the advertisements, through commercials, so there is a kind of an impact, deep impact on the people, and people will buy your product, they will patronize your institutions, and of course they will start liking your product, because whatever they see on the media, they have a deep influence in their minds, and their thoughts are converted into the buying action. Now coming on to the political advertising. India has got so many political parties, so many national parties, etc. So the political advertising can really support and assist the working of democratic process, but it can only also obstruct it also. This happens when, for example, the cost of advertising limit the political competition to wealthy candidate seekers. They compromise to a wealthy candidates or the group which requires the office seekers compromise their integrity and independence by over-dependence on the special interest for the funds. The political parties are using the media as a very effective tool for sending their messages to reach out the people in the country, because the more flowery language they use, the more effective messages they draft, it will also impact their future also. I am talking specifically about the political parties, and this is the modus operandi which they use by drafting such effective good messages, and they send across the people at large in the country. So, India Shining is an excellent example. When the Vajpayee government spent more than 600 crores of the public money to get a political mileage, which somehow bombarded on them. From a policy perspective, this evidence on the importance of media in the corporate governance has two important consequences. So, the first is the previous research and the empirical studies show that has mostly focused on the legal and contractual aspects of the corporate governance. Research suggests that this focus should be broadened and the policy debate should undergo a similar shift in the focus. Secondly, the press pressures the managers to act not in a shareholder's interest but also in publicly acceptable manner. This finding brings the role of the societal norms to forefront of the corporate governance debate. Now coming on to media and corporate governance. With a few notable exceptions, according to Coffey 2001, which is a very important study in this regard, the role of these norms has been completely ignored. Yet, they may present an opportunity for the reformers, and if they can increase the communication about the behavior that violates the norms and those norms support the effective corporate governance. However, they might also represent a major obstacle to any attempt to improve the country's corporate governance system. In the countries where the firing workers to increase the profit is viewed negatively, creating incentives for managers to do will be extremely difficult, especially in the highly visible companies. This should be openly considered in any realistic plan to reform a country's corporate governance systems. Now, the press also interacts and intersects with the various corporate governance mechanisms. Now, let us see the shareholders, activism and the press. The activism such as Robert Monks and Neil Minow have found the press useful in their fights with the management in the United States. Does the press have a similar effect in emerging markets? Is a big question mark. The recent events in the Republic of Korea indicates that it does. Korea has long been known as a place where the controlling shareholders in the largest Korean firms take advantage of their position at the expense of the small investors. The national corporate laws, they convey few rights to outside investors. They score only 2 out of 5 in La Porta and others. Index that measures the strength of protection for minority shareholders and expectations in relation to law enforcement, etc. Now, again, a part of the shareholder activism and press. Let me, further this topic. According to an index designed to access the law and other traditions, the Korea has a level half of the average countries. The beginning of efforts to force the changes in Korea databases right back in 1996 and the formation of the People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, that is PSPD, driven by Jang Hang-seung of the Korea University. As in the United States, this index activist has focused the attention on changing the corporate policies in the largest Korean firms and has relied both on the legal pressures, including the proxy battles, criminal suits and derivative suits, and on such use of the press to shame the corporate leaders into the changing of their policies. Now, perhaps to an event greater extent than in United States, the success stories have resulted more from the creation of the public opinion pressures from the legal sanctions. The most important successful change to the data and has been the battle to stop the insider dealings in SK Telecom. SK Telecom was an extremely profitable company, but its financial results did not show this because the company used to transfer price to benefit the company is about 100% owned by the chairperson of SK Telecom and his relatives. So, PSPD drew attention to these policies. After the London-based Financial Times picked up the story as a media campaign ensured to they attract the proxy votes. This campaign involved the publicly advertisements in newspapers and using the television and the radio. Then in March 1998, SK Telecom's director, they capitalized and agreed to the PSPD's request. Now it's a very interesting story. This success stands in sharp contrast with the failure of the legal actions. For example, the shareholders' proposal are severely restricted and cannot involve the removal of the directors or the auditors. Perhaps the only successful legal challenge has been one of to ensure the investor rights to speak at a meeting, though the right to speak can only be used to affect the reputation of the parties involved, not to trigger any legal remedy. For example, the press gave extensive coverage to the fact that the Samsung shareholders meeting lasted for more than 13 hours. The effect of shareholder and the public opinion pressure was an increase in the transparency of the Samsung's financial statements. Now coming on to a very interesting part, that is about the institutional investors. Now who are these? Institutional investors have many legal mechanisms to encourage the change in the corporate policies. The presence of an active press increases their influence definitely, and it provides a relatively cheap way to impose the penalties on the companies and definitely to coordinate the response of their other investors in availing themselves of the potential legal protection. Now, institutional investors have many legal mechanisms to encourage the change in the corporate policies. The presence of an active press increases their influence, and it provides a relatively cheap way to impose the penalties on the companies and to coordinate the response of other investors in availing themselves of the potential legal protection. Now coming on to the private and the government regulators. Public opinion pressure generated by an active press plays a very important role in the efforts by the private sector organizations to use the self-regulation to impose the corporate governance. You consider the approach in the United Kingdom to range of the financial scandals of the year 1980, including the collapse of the Bank of Credit and the Commerce International and the Maxwell Group. Instead of legal and proscribed certain activities matched by the court sanctions and fines, the United Kingdom pursued self-regulation enforced through disclosure. The Cadbury Committee, dominated by the private sector, defined the corporate governance standards and developed the mechanisms to compel the disclosure of performance relative to the standards, allowing the force of the public pressure generated by the disclosure. Now there are certain private and government regulators. So let us talk about that. This publicity route had the advantage that the self-regulatory organizations had the power to impose it, and the penalties could be introduced very quickly. The alternative sanctions such as the fines and court-enforced penalties were either unavailable or could be delayed through the court proceedings, thereby limiting their effectiveness. The Cadbury Committee, which submitted its report way back in December 1992, was the first effort at the reform by means of disclosure and the public pressure. The key element of the report was a code of the best practice with 19 recommendations, including an enhanced role for independent directors, a minimum number of independent directors, and the separation of the roles of the chairperson and a CEO, that is the Chief Executive Officer of the company. Now, since 1993, the London Stock Exchange has made a requirement of listing a company to include a statement of performance relative to a code and a written explanation for any variation in its annual reports. It has since become a common practice for the company statements issued to press for an independent press reports to identify the performances relative to code standards, with the lack of compliance described largely as a failure of the corporate governance by the company and its directors. A similar approach regarding the company's practices towards the executive compensation was adopted in Greenbury report issued in July 1995 and in the Hample report released in July and January 1998. All these best practices have been consolidated into a super code published by LSE, that is the London Stock Exchange, way back in June 1998, again with a requirement of disclosure rather than a compliance. So, I hope with these words the private and the government regulations and the regulators aspects are clear to you. So, rest I will take in the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Students, we will be continuing in the next session. Thank you. Welcome viewers. Now we will be continuing where we had left. Let's welcome ma'am. Welcome ma'am.
So, in this session I will be taking forward on the private and the government regulators. The public opinion pressure generated by an active press plays a very vital and pertinent role in the efforts by the private sector organizations to use the self-regulation to improve the corporate governance. You have to consider the approach in the United Kingdom to change the financial scandals of 1980. including the collapse of Bank of Credit and the commercial international Maxwell Group. Instead of legislation that they prescribe certain activities matched by the court sanctions and fines, the United Kingdom pursued a self-regulation and enforced through disclosures. The Cadbury Committee, dominated by the private sector, it defined the corporate governance standards and developed the mechanisms to compel the disclosure of performance relative to standards, allowing the force of the public pressure generated by the disclosure. Now, this publicity route had an advantage of self-regulatory organizations, and they had the power to impose it, and the penalty could be introduced very quickly. Alternative sanctions such as fines and the overall problems as far as the cut and forced penalties are concerned, they are either unavailable or could be delayed through the court proceedings, thereby limiting their effectiveness. The Cadbury Committee, which submitted its report way back in December 1992, was the first effort at a reform by means of disclosure and public pressures. The key element of the report was a code of the best practice with 19 recommendations, including an enhanced role for the independent directors and a minimum number of independent directors as a whole, and the separation of the roles of the chairperson and a CEO. Since 1993, the London Stock Exchange has made a requirement of listing that a company to include a statement of performance relative to the code and the written explanation for any variation in the annual reports. It has been since become a common practice for the company's statements issued to the press and for the independent press reports to identify the performance relative to a code standards, with the lack of compliance described largely as a failure of the corporate governance by the company and its directors. Now, a similar approach regarding the company practices towards the effective compensation was adopted by a Greenberry report issued in July 1995 and the Hampel report released in January 1998. All these best practices has been consolidated into a super code published by LSE, that is the London Stock Exchange, way back in June 1998, again with a requirement for a disclosure rather than a compliance. The extent and the success of a disclosure and the public approach is quite widespread. In Hong Kong, China, the stock exchange has historically not had a legal authority to impose the penalties on the companies that misbehave. Instead, it uses the media as a sanction, taking out the advertisement space to notify the public about the firm's security violations. Because if it comes in public domains, it becomes more effective to know about the public that the irregularities are happening. The threat is usually enough, shaming in both a personal penalty for the executives involved and may introduce a financial penalty if others now update their beliefs about the reliability of the executives and the company and increase their terms of financing projects suggested by the executives. Now we are coming on to a pressure versus other mechanisms for addressing the governance problems. Whatever we are talking, we are having an ethical perspective behind it. In some markets, the penalties that can be imposed by the press are at least as important as other mechanisms for fighting the misgovernance that the literature more commonly focuses on. Consistent with the contention is a recent survey in Malaysia that asked the institutional investors and the equity analysts to identify the factors that were most important in assessing the corporate governance and decided to invest in public listed corporations. The analyst, though the frequency and the nature of public and press comments about the company were more important than the host of other factors that receive more attention in academic debate, such as the company's relationships with the regulatory authorities, the number of independent non-executive directors, their qualifications, the existence of remuneration and audit committees, and to identify the company auditors. In 1988, the magazine Business Week started to publish a rank of top US business schools. Despite its arguable criteria, most students experience no more than one business school, yet their responses are used to rank them. This ranking gained a lot of attention and soon assumed the role of standard in the industry. While there may be of any systematic study of effect of the introduction of this ranking, the governance of the business schools, their impact is undoubtedly huge. Suddenly, teaching ratings, because of the important faculties, were held accountable. New programs were introduced to cater to the student needs, and now some schools were even caught coaching their own students how to respond to the Business Week questionnaires. So this is definitely very unethical in nature. So far as we have treated the media as a single entity that aggregates and then communicates information, a critical issue we have ignored is the credibility of the information the media communicates to the public at large, which is of course extremely important. The fact that overall we are now talking about selective coverage and the media credibility. The fact that the Financial Times reported the SK Telecom and Gazprom insider deals brought about the credibility to the stories, because even in Korea and Russia, the Financial Times is more, the credible than the local newspapers. Similarly, the Business Week rankings of the business school had much greater impact than the US. Now coming on to this, the news and the World Report rankings, because the former is not only more diffused but also more authoritative than the latter. The issue of credibility is particularly delicate because it opens up the questions of the newspapers, incentives to conduct the further investigations to establish the validity of the information reported to them, and of course the incentives to report the information it received accurately. Now, selective coverage and media credibility. It is precisely when the newspaper do have an impact, then they have an incentive to enter into the side deals with the parties involved, and of course they are paid to reveal the damaging information. The threats to increase or uphold the future advertising revenues in exchange of the stories that reflect well or badly on the company management and the directors are one example of the side deals. And of course, such side deals might hurt the reputation of the newspaper in the long run and hence its credibility too. Now, if it is more difficult for an individual newspaper to build a reputation of integrity in a market where all the other newspapers are counting, the possibility for the multiple equilibrium arises. One equilibrium is where the newspapers have credibility and thus avoid the side deals for the fear of losing it, and secondly, another there is where the newspapers do not have the credibility and happily accept the bribes not to publish the damaging information or to publish the false damaging information. The important factors that determine which equilibrium prevails are the competitive environment in which the newspapers operate, the ownership structures of the media, and the libel laws. Now coming on to the selective coverage and the media credibility further, in the competitive market, a newspaper agreeing not to publish the bad news is likely to be scooped by another newspaper and to lose the credibility. Thus, the more competitive the environment is, the less likely is the collusive equilibrium. Similarly, an independent newspaper where the survival rests solemnly in its own success is less likely to collude with the established business interest. By contrast, a newspaper owned by a business group is naturally less likely to publish the bad news about the group itself. Now, this in turn affects the credibility in correctly reporting the other news, thereby reducing its incentives to build up a reputation and to increase its incentives and to collude. More stringent libel laws reduces the likelihood of a newspaper published information that suggests that the managers are bad, again reducing the information content of the media. Now we are coming on to the consumer demand and selective coverage. Demand considerations also lead to a selective focus on the stories with the wide interest, such as effective compensation levels, rather than the other elements of the good corporate governance, the composition of the boards, the role of the auditors, and even the scandals such as Enron and WorldCom. The readers may also be able to appreciate the nuances of the corporate situations. How come? This leads to the news stories that simplify the firm's performance relative to the environmental or the corporate governance standards. Now, basically, when you're talking about the readers, also about the consumer demand and selective also, in United Kingdom, example, the recommendations developed in the Cadbury, Greenberry, Hampel reports are often qualified that they are rarely the way. The public version is a gross oversimplification around the bright line rules. They are producing the box checking and intense pressure to conform the standards which are entirely different from those which are intended. Finally, the demand for the corporate governance news might depend on the structure. The role of the press are likely to be more important when the broad group of the citizens have a personal interest in the outcomes because of their own direct or indirect through the pension funds shareholdings. The importance corporate governance, idol played by the media in Korea and Malaysia, it described the earlier is probably attributable to the widespread dispersion of the ownership in publicly traded firms these two countries. The media play definitely an equally important role in shaping the corporate policy in addition to the government and the regulatory bodies. The media selectively reduce the cost of acquiring and verifying the information. This information is definitely very crucial in shaping the reputation of the key players where it determines the corporate policy. Now, the reputation that decision makers seem to care about is not just the reputation in the eyes of the current and the future employers, but more broadly, the reputation in the eyes of the public at large, that is, their own public image. It only concerns about their public image would explain the responsiveness of the corporate directors to environmental issues. which have a zero or negative impact on the wealth of their ultimate employers, that is, the shareholders. The effects of the media are not only, the anecdota. The more diffuse the press in a country is, the more companies are responsive both to the environmental issues and to the minority shareholder concerns, even after controlling for the presence of specific laws and the regulations and the level of law enforcement. The media can help the shareholders or can hurt them also. Now, it is noted that the media is very important. In what? In shaping the corporate policy and not to be ignored in any analysis of the country's corporate governance systems. Now, we are coming to the most interesting part of the lecture, that is the ethics in advertising. What is ethics? Ethics is a set of moral values which the public endorse, and it defines the rightness and the wrongness of an action. Now, let me give you a deep insight of ethics in advertising. Advertising is one of the major tools the corporate use to direct persuasive communication to the target buyers and the public. They advise, advertise to inform the potential buyers of the existence of a product, definitely, and to establish a positive attitude towards it. According to Aristotle, one of the basic the concepts in effective persuasion is to be ethical. Now, basically, what advertising is all about? Advertising creates the information, persuasion, remembrance, and it converts your thoughts into very positive attitude buying action, wherein the attitude is completely changed towards a product. A good thought is made about the product, the positive attitude towards it, and of course it is a very, very important and ethical tool as far as the effective communication is concerned. Every advertiser is very important. It needs to be ethical. The Raymond Bohart has quoted in his book, An Honest Profit, what business says about the ethics in business. Ethical is what my feelings tell me it is right. Of course, ethics means the rightness and the wrongness of an action. If you are being ethical, you are right. If you are not being ethical, you are wrong. The ethical means accepted standard norms in terms of your own personal and social welfare, what you believe is a right. So, definitely when you are following the ethics in your advertising, that means you are moving towards a right path. You are moving towards a path of honest profits, because there are two ways by which you can earn profits, one an unethical way and the other is an ethical way. So, of course, if you follow the ethical way, whatever profits you have, they are the honest profits. And let me tell you very frankly, if you are being ethical in your approach, the profits will also increase manifolds and vice versa. Now, for decades together, the broad social and economic issues have been raised concern the role of advertising in society. This is an era of vigilant, well-informed customers who wants to know what is there in a product and who produces it, under what working conditions they are produced. So, this is an era in which the corporates will have more lasting relationships with the consumers than of the market products. So, what is ethics in advertising? Of course, the person has all the rights to know about the conditions under which the product is made, what policies are being followed, what relationships have been, condoned with, etc. So, there are certain social accusations which have been directed at advertising in such pungent, imaginative terms that appear to be emanate from the talents as creative as those wherein the advertising community is concerned. Advertising is said to destroy the finer things of the life, it has been described as sometimes vulgar, sometimes idiotic, degrading, shrill, noisy, blatant and aggressive. Now, it is said to, they extract the low values and glorify the mediocrity. A number of humanities and the social science scholars view the advertising as intrusive and environmental, and its effect as inescapable and of course profound. They see it as a reinforcing materialism, cynicism, irrationality, selflessness, anxiety, social competitiveness, sexual preoccupation, powerlessness and a loss of self-respect. The corporate governance, there are strong indictments which imply the advertising is a powerful force that could cause a lot of harm if it is unregulated. Now, coming on to the beneficial effects of advertising. First is the information. Advertising aids in the education of general public, facilitates the exercise of a free choice and the free will. The subsidies mass communication, providing essential services to the public. Now, coming on to the second beneficial effect of advertising is about the values and the lifestyles. Advertising contributes to the improvement in the standard of living, contribution to sharing of the opulence, that is the comforts among the masses, and represents as essential factor in the economies of abundance. Next is your important creative experience. Advertising adds new and interesting experience to the life. Discussion on the ethical aspects of advertising can be organized around the various features identified in the statements mentioned above, its social effects, its creation of the consumer desires and its effect on the consumer beliefs. Now, there is a big problem as far as the deception is concerned. What is deception? Deception is to deceive the customer. So, sometimes the advertisement are untruthful. So, the outcome is that you are deceiving the customers by manipulating the advertisement, by using the deceptive advertisements, etc. So, deception, a deceptive advertisement is one which creates a material untruth, is told or hinted at. The use of a secondary meaning of a word is also considered as a deception. For example, a soft drink may be described as an orange drink through its artificially flavored. Then we use the concept of a fear appeals, which is also criticized immensely. Now, you use the fear that if you do not use this, you will have this problem. So, it creates a kind of an image in the minds of the customers that they are terribly feared about certain things. So, their convictions are made accordingly. So, when they use the fear appeals, the customer, they are always will have a stressed state of mind, and of course, they will buy a product under those stressed circumstances, which is of course unethical in nature. So, the fear appeals have been criticized immensely. The intent of the fear appeals is to create anxiety in the minds of the consumers and provoke them to make use of the particular products to elevate the fear in him or her. Now, coming on to the advertising to children. Many advertisers, they cater to children only. Most of the advertisements, for example, they use the chocolates, ice creams, they are directed towards the children. Children between ages 2 to 11, they spend about 3 hours a day watching a television. The preschool children cannot differentiate between a commercial and a program. So, they do not understand the selling intent of a commercial and cannot distinguish between a fantasy and a reality. So, I think the children are mostly influenced by the fantasy rather than the reality. They are shown an artificial world wherein their tender minds are affected. So, this is also unethical. Thirdly, the children which are between the ages 7 to 12, they have a very difficult balancing their highly sugar products, the long term health risk of the deceased gums and the tooth decays are very, very high in this case. Fourthly, there are hardly any counter ads for the fruits and the vegetables, which is more healthy in nature. And the last is, most of these advertisements are deceptive in nature, as they omit significant information such as the complexity, the safety of operating the toys. However, the defenders of the advertisers to the children offered the following positive effect. First, advertising gives the product's information to the child that assist him or her in making a decision. The children are developing the skills through the advertising and will be able to more independently make better selections among the products, among the targeted ones. Third, advertising is influence on the process of socialization. It means whereby the children learn the value system and the norms, the society they are entering into. So I think with the concept of ethical advertising, the effects, the benefits, overall ethical customer can create their own mind, their own certainty about the product and how the advertisers they build up their mind, etc. So let me give you a recap, because this is the most significant part of ethics in advertising. So a small recap can give you a lot of convictions in your mind. Advertisement, as I told you, is a very important sponsored tool wherein you pay for what you want to be communicated to the public at large. So basically, when you talk about the advertising, there are three types of effects. The information dissemination effect, wherein the information is given to the public at large. The persuasion communication skills are used, wherein the thoughts are converted into the buying action by a persuasive appeal which they use in the advertisement. And finally, the remembrance of that they are still there in the market and they are still catering to the product. So this is most important. So this is definitely the effective persuasion, and whatever we are talking about has to be ethical in nature. Any unethical activity can really jeopardize the minds of the customers, and thus this can be a disequilibrium in the market also. Sometimes the advertisers they use very different appeals which they should not use, especially when you talk about the making use of those products which only the children use, and overall the impulse buying is done by the female sector and the children's sector. So these are the two vulnerable sections of the society, and in most of the cases they are targeted. Why? Because they use more of emotions in buying rather than rationality in their buying. So they hit the minds of the women and the children to be successful in the market, to implant themselves in the market, because sometimes we should not be using this, and there is an Advertising Standard Council of India wherein certain advertisements were under the scanner and certain advertisements were even modified, and they were forced to modify their TVCs because either the message was wrong or there was use of puffery. Sometimes in the advertisement some unsubstantiated claims are used, like for example in a particular advertisement it is written that about 10,000 or 1 million copies are sold every day. So who is certifying this? So these are all ethical question marks which have to be answered, and nowadays when you talk about the consumers have to play a very significant pivotal role in judging about the market and judging about the product, whether the product is actually good or bad. So it is the strategies of the marketers which are there and straight away influencing the minds of the consumers. So as an intelligent, as a rational consumers, you have to bifurcate your thinking in terms of the rightness and the wrongness of the concepts which are used in the marketing strategy, because they are there to sell the product and we are there to buy the product as a consumer. So they will sell what they want to sell and we will consume what we want to consume. So there is a very thin line and sometimes that thin line is broken by the marketer, but you should be intelligent enough to maintain that line in terms of it should allow them to break only when you actually want that product, and sometimes the unethical aspects are definitely used in the marketing strategies and the advertising, which the customer should say no to such products. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Students, we will be having more such interesting sessions in the upcoming future. Thank you and goodbye.